This is Jeff Saunders, couples therapist. This is the fourth session I've recorded around the process of getting things right if you're a couple that's in distress. And as I've intimated, that's most people. So what I've covered with you so far is to tell you that fundamentally the way you relate is caused by attachment styles. What are termed attachment styles? That was a term that was coined way back in the 50s and 60s when the first work was done with toddlers, in fact. And the terms that were used back then were anxious and secure for the people that I call connectors, because they're anxious about relationship and getting it sorted, and the avoidant and secure around people who will withdraw and pull away. I call them withdrawers because they find conflict too difficult, and so they want to withdraw from conflict, minimize drama, and so on. However, there is a third category which is common. There are other categories, but there are a third common, and that is people who are anxious about connecting and therefore pull away and become avoidant even though they're the connector style. So a connector style, if in fact they feel like this is hopeless, they're not getting anywhere, they're not making progress, then what can happen is that they will pull away and close down, probably go through the motions, but fundamentally close down, and we call that style anxious/avoidant. That's what it was called in the original research. I call that style reluctant withdrawers. They don't usually do that because they want to do that. They do that because they pull away like that because they feel that there's no possibility. So let me talk today about how that style would work and give you some examples of that style. But you're getting a pattern here. You're getting to see that fundamentally people are wired several ways. Now, I talked to you earlier about what I call 6 drivers. So the drivers are the pieces of this puzzle that work invisibly to undermine relationships. And the key driver is the attachment style. Once you understand the attachment style, others flow from it. So what can happen once a person understands their attachment style, they then need to understand their disempowerment style or risks of disempowerment that go with it. And generally, the disempowerment pattern is the second of the 6 drivers. So disempowerment is more common with connectors, and the difficulty is withdrawers frequently don't know they're disempowering their partners. All they see is their partner stops talking or backs away or does something like that. They don't realize it's disempowerment because withdrawers are not as emotionally aware as connectors. So when withdrawers get disempowered, they don't realize that's happening usually because many of them struggle to tell you any feelings they're having. So the classic example when a withdrawer would get disempowered would be when they feel criticized, and then they tend to get defensive. They tend to get defensive when they're criticized. And really what they're doing is they're defending themselves against shame. I've mentioned this. But when they do that, they can back away, and frequently they don't quite know what to say. They don't understand the feelings that go with this disempowerment pattern, and they very quickly deal to those feelings, usually without knowing they're having them. So for example, the withdrawer will just pull away, close down, go out and do the garden or head off somewhere. So they will withdraw, not realizing that in fact the reason they've done that because they didn't know what to say, they didn't have a comeback answer to their partner, or they maybe didn't want to get involved in another argument, and they frequently don't know that they can say, hey look, I'm feeling disempowered there, or I'm feeling put down or criticized, can we talk about this? Because it sounds like there must be two different points of view here. No, that doesn't happen. Very rarely happens. What people do is they keep reacting to each other. There's a constant reactivity that's invisible to them, which is very sad. So, as I said, there is a tendency now for the anxious types. They're anxious only around relationships. So withdrawers get anxious around tasks and getting stuff done and getting things sorted. They get anxious around money. They get anxious around making sure things are fixed, getting to work, doing stuff at work. But they can get anxious around relationship when they feel like it doesn't matter what they do, they get it wrong. Now that's not really a feeling. What they really do is they feel defensive, or they feel undermined, or they feel hopeless or helpless around talking to their partner in a constructive way. But very, very few of them would know those feelings were going on, so they don't also usually know that they've been disempowered. All they do, though, is like leave the scene of the crime in order to empower themselves. So last time I talked about Sam and Susie. Sam was an avoidant guy who actually, once he was in my office, was very connecting, because he had a very good connection with his mother, and so he was naturally soft and engaging. Now that isn't true of most avoidants. Most men withdraw considerably, and I'm going to give you an example today of a guy who withdrew considerably. He was what I would call dismissive, so that's a very extreme version of withdrawing. So when people are that withdrawn, when they're dismissive, it's almost uniquely males who are so distant. They close themselves down and they just get on with the jobs of life, because they just do not want to risk engagement with their partner. They find them too volatile, too intense, too over the top, too hard to understand, and so on. Now the woman in her, this man's life, so I'll call him Bob and I'll call her Jane. So when Bob would go distant like this, Jane would get very, very upset that he was so distant, and she would try and control him and make things happen, because she was left alone with the family. She was left alone to do things, so rather than engage him, she just became the boss. And so you can understand what would happen. She got really annoyed that he wasn't participating enough, felt she was the only person doing anything in the relationship, any relating or any wanting to relate. And that's very common. Connectors often feel like they're the only person who feels like they really want to relate. So what Jane did was she got extremely controlling and very, very blaming of Bob. And you can understand where that went. Basically, Jane wore the pants, she dictated terms, and Bob just kept his head down. He even struggled to engage with the children, because engaging was definitely not his strength. And he had had a very, very distant relationship with his parents. Virtually he had brought himself up, he had been a loner, as many young boys can do. And so when it came to relating with Jane, he did not have the skill base. He just did not know how to relate. He didn't know how to talk about himself. He didn't really know what to do at all, apart from bring home the bacon, which he did well. But that wasn't enough for Jane. So in a situation like this, where the connector gets to be very dominant, you can understand that the withdrawer finds that very, very difficult to cope with. The over-the-top connector tends to rule the roost and be bossy and dominant and Usually if the man is not so withdrawn, he might talk about that, or he might want to say this is not good enough. But what Bob did was just keep his head down. So this is another example of how a more intense connector style, but in this time, unlike Susie I spoke before, you see Susie was very lovely, very loving, didn't want to be dominant at all. She just wanted engagement. But what Jane did with Bob was she wanted to be dominant. She liked being dominant. She liked controlling. And so her control pattern and her intensity meant that he just kept his head down permanently. So you can see the difficulty here is that we're dealing with people who operate functionally very, very differently. I have to work hard to get connectors to connect in a way that's calm and engaging, and in such a way that their partners will understand them. And once they understand the differences and what to do about that and how their partner's wired, they can do that. The avoidants, on the other hand, those who withdraw, whether they're dismissive or avoidant, they're going to struggle to engage, but I teach them how to engage with a communication pattern that means they don't have to understand their partner, or they don't have to go out of their way to understand their partner. They just need to stay engaged and encourage their partner to do the talking about what it is they want. Now, what can happen if that occurs and it's done slowly, the withdrawer can then find the space to state what they would like. It's most difficult for an avoidant to state where they're at and what they would like when it's too intense. And when they start correcting their partner or telling their partner what to do, that's not the way to do it. So in the next video, I will talk about these 6 drivers. I'll talk about the 6 drivers prior to then starting off the course, which helps you understand all these drivers in general. In fact, I do module 1 and module 2. Well, actually they're called section 1 and section 2. In those sections, you are helped to understand exactly what is going on with each of these 6 drivers. So maybe have a look at the last introductory video I do. The course will be called Couples Therapy, so that's fairly easy to find, and I will talk to you more after I've closed this down and we run the next video, and I'll talk about the drivers and a little bit more about how they will be worked with. So have a good day. I will be seeing you in video 5 very shortly.